The banquet hall of Ironvale Keep had never looked so cruel. June had told herself, the entire walk from the servants' quarter where she had dressed, that she would not allow herself to feel too much. She had braided her own hair. No one had offered to help, and borrowed a needle and thread from old Marta to fix the hem of the dress she had sewn herself over 3 weeks of stolen candlelight hours. It was a simple gown, pale cream linen with silver stitching along the collar, nothing compared to the silk and velvet worn by the daughters of high Alcatias. But she had made it with her own hands, and that had meant something. It still meant something. She told herself that too. The great hall was alive with the warmth of 100 torches, their flames catching the gold thread of tapestries that bore the sigil of the Ashford pack, a wolf mid-leap over a crescent moon. Long stone tables stretched from one end of the hall to the other, crowded with pack elders, warriors, noble daughters, and the heads of 7 allied clans who had traveled days to be present at the claiming banquet. This was the night when unmated wolves of noble blood announced their intentions before the Alcatia, and the hall hummed with anticipation, wine, and the heavy perfume of pine resin burning in iron braziers along the walls. June stood near the arched entrance and searched for Cole. He had told her to meet him by the east pillar before the ceremony began. He had told her he would present her tonight. Those had been his exact words, spoken 3 weeks ago in the forest clearing where they had walked together since she was 19. She was 23 now. And he had looked at her with that half-smile she had spent years trusting, and said, "I want everyone to see you standing beside me, June. I want the Alcatia to know you are mine." She had gone home and sewn the dress. Cole Ashford was the second son of Elder Rowan Ashford, which made him no king, but it made him respected, known, a young alpha of standing who would one day lead a branch of the Ashford territory. And June was nobody. She had no pack name worth speaking. Her mother had died when she was 12, her father had disappeared long before that, and she had grown up in the outer settlement of Ironvale, under the guardianship of old Marta, who was kind but powerless. June worked in the keep's library, cataloging records of pack lineages and ancient territorial maps. She was educated and quiet and, she had always believed, invisible. But Cole had seen her, or so she had believed. She spotted him near the east pillar, and her chest filled with something warm before it turned to ice. He was not alone. Beside him stood Celeste Vorn, daughter of Alpha Vorn of the Crescent Ridge Pack, a woman dressed in deep burgundy silk, with a collar of silver fur, her dark hair woven with small braids threaded with amber beads. She was laughing at something Cole had just said, her gloved hand resting on his forearm with the ease of someone who had been allowed to stand there many times before. June stopped walking. Cole saw her. She watched his expression shift, not into guilt, not even into apology, but into something far worse. Calculation. He excused himself from Celeste briefly and crossed to June, and the closer he got, the more she understood that he had already decided everything before tonight began. "You came," he said. "You asked me to," she replied. He glanced at her dress. He did not say anything about it. "June, I need you to understand that tonight things have changed. My father has been in talks with Elder Vorn for months. A union between our packs would strengthen the territory considerably." He paused. "Celeste and I will announce our intention to mate tonight." The hall continued its noise around them. Torches burned. Wine was poured. June said nothing for a moment. She was aware of the silver stitching at her collar. She was aware of the 3 weeks of candlelight and the borrowed needle. She was aware that she was standing very still, because if she moved even slightly, something inside her might shatter in a way that would be visible, and she would not give this hall the satisfaction. "You told me you would present me tonight," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "I told you I wanted the Alcatia to know you." He had the audacity to speak gently, as if gentleness made it cleaner. "They will know you, June, just not in the way I..." Things changed. Pack politics are more complicated than... "I understand," she said. And she turned away from him before he could finish. She walked toward the far end of the hall, away from the tables, away from the noise, her spine straight and her hands at her sides, and her jaw set with a force that ached. She would not cry here. She would not give the daughters of High Alcatayas, who had always watched her with mild disdain, the image of her weeping beside a pillar. She would walk out. She would go back to the library. She would be fine. She was nearly at the side corridor when she heard the hall go quiet. Not the natural quiet of a ceremony about to begin, a different kind of quiet. The kind that happened when something entered a room that commanded silence without asking for it. June slowed without meaning to. 3 men had entered through the main doors at the opposite end of the hall, and the crowd had parted for them, the way water parts for stone. She turned slightly, just enough to see. The first was broad and loose-limbed, with a grin that seemed aimed at everyone and no one, his dark eyes moving over the hall with barely contained amusement. The second was leaner, sharp-featured, with the kind of composed expression that suggested he found most things either interesting or faintly ridiculous, and had not yet decided which this occasion was. The third walked between them and slightly ahead, and June understood immediately why the hall had gone silent. He was tall in the way that mountains were tall, not just in measurement, but in presence, in the sense that the space around him rearranged itself to accommodate him. Dark braids pulled back from a face that was severe and still, pale blue eyes scanning the room with the slow, unhurried attention of someone who had learned long ago that nothing required his urgency. He wore black leather armor crossed with dark straps, a fur mantle across his shoulders, and at his side, half hidden by the hang of his cloak, was the hilt of a blade she suspected had been used more than once. Someone near June whispered the name in a breath that was half reverence and half fear. Evander Crest, the Alpha King. June had heard of him. Everyone had. He ruled the Crest territory to the north, a vast and ancient dominion that had not bent its knee to any alliance in 3 generations. He came to no banquets. He accepted no invitations. His presence in Ironvale Keep tonight was, by every measure she could think of, impossible. She should have kept walking. Instead, she stood still, half-turned in the corridor entrance, and watched him move through the hall. And then she watched him stop. He had stopped because his second, the lean, sharp-featured one, had leaned in and said something low. The Alpha King's gaze moved across the room with that same unhurried pace, and then it found her. June felt it like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. He looked at her the way no one in this hall had ever looked at her. Not with the mild curiosity she was used to. Not with the dismissal. Not even with Cole's careful warmth that had turned out to mean nothing. Evander Crest looked at her as if he recognized her. As if she had interrupted something he had been trying to finish for a very long time. He did not move toward her. He did not look away either. The hall continued its stunned murmur around him. Elders straightening, noble daughters smoothing their gowns, Cole Ashford somewhere behind her, forgetting entirely about Celeste Vaughan for one confused moment. June turned and walked into the corridor. But she did not go far. She stood just inside the shadow of the stone arch, her back against the cold wall, and pressed one hand flat against the silver stitching at her collar. Her mother's favorite color. Silver, the reason she had chosen this thread. And breathed. She had walked out of the hall with her dignity intact. She had not wept. She had not begged. She had not made a single sound that anyone could carry back to her as proof of weakness. What she had not anticipated was the weight of those pale blue eyes following her into the dark. The corridor smelled of old stone and tallow candles, and June stood in it long enough to feel the cold seeping through the wall and into her spine. She told herself she was only catching her breath. She told herself she would leave in a moment, take the servants' passage behind the east tower, cross the courtyard, and return to the small room above the library where she lived among stacked maps and the smell of old parchment. She would make tea from the dried herbs on her windowsill. She would be fine by morning. She had been fine before, and before, and before that. She was still telling herself this when footsteps entered the corridor behind her. Not the loose, careless steps of someone passing through. Deliberate. Even. The kind of steps that belonged to someone who had decided to be exactly where they were. She turned. The lean, sharp-featured man stood at the corridor entrance, one shoulder resting against the stone arch, with the ease of someone who had perfected the art of appearing unhurried. He had dark eyes that caught the torchlight from the hall behind him, and the faint curve at the corner of his mouth suggested he was either amused or curious, or both. "You left early," he said. June kept her expression neutral. "I wasn't aware my schedule required approval." He smiled at that, a real one, brief and genuine. "It doesn't. I'm only observing." He pushed off the wall and stepped closer, not crowding, just present. Soren Crest, the king's cousin and, depending on the hour, either his most trusted advisor or his greatest inconvenience. She looked at him steadily. "June. Just June. That's all there is." He tilted his head slightly, as if that answer had confirmed something. Before he could say more, the second man appeared behind him. The broad one with the easy grin, who ducked under the arch and filled the corridor with a warmth that seemed entirely native to him. "Found her?" he announced, as if this were a pleasant surprise rather than the result of obvious intent. "I'm Davin, also Crest. Also considerably more charming than Soren, though he'll argue otherwise." He looked at her dress, then at her face, then at the empty corridor behind her with an expression that managed to be both light and knowing. "You were leaving." "I was," June said. "The banquet hasn't started. I know." Davin glanced at Soren. Something passed between them. Not a word. Not quite a look. Something quieter than both. Then Davin stepped aside, and June understood why. Evander Crest stood at the corridor entrance. He had to lower his head slightly to clear the arch, and then he straightened, and the corridor, which had felt merely dim before, seemed to rearrange its shadows around him. Up close he was more severe than he had appeared across the hall. The jaw harder, the lines at the corners of his eyes suggesting not age but attention. Years of watching things carefully. The pale blue eyes were extraordinary, she thought, in the way that cold things could be extraordinary. Clear and deep and entirely unreadable. He looked at her and said nothing for a moment. June held his gaze because looking away felt like losing something, and she had already lost enough tonight. Then he reached into the inner fold of his leather armor, a deliberate movement, careful, and withdrew something small. He held it out toward her. It was a scrap of folded paper, worn at the edges, the kind of worn that came from being handled many times over many years. He unfolded it with one hand, slowly, and held it so she could see. It was a drawing. Charcoal on rough paper, the kind of paper used in old pack records. A child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, sitting in tall grass with her knees pulled to her chest and her hair loose around her shoulders. The drawing was simple, but careful. Someone had taken time with it, had paid attention to the particular way the child held herself, the slight tilt of her head, the way her hands were folded. June's breath stopped. She knew that drawing. She had not seen it in 16 years, but she knew it the way you knew the sound of your own name. Before thought, before reason, in some older part of the self that remembered without trying. Her mother had drawn it. Alara, who had been gifted with a steady hand and a box of charcoal sticks she treated like treasure. June had been 7 years old, sitting in the field behind the outer settlement on a late summer afternoon, and her mother had sat in the grass a few yards away and drawn her without telling her, and then shown her afterward with that quiet smile she'd had. The one that meant, I wanted to remember this. June had not known there were 2 copies. "Where did you get this?" she said. It was not quite a question. Her voice had gone very still. Evander's expression shifted. Not softened, but changed, the way stone changes when light hits it from a different angle. "It was in my brother's wallet," he said. "Ronan. He died 14 months ago." The name landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Ronan Crest. She had not spoken that name aloud in years. She had been 7 years old, when a young wolf from the Northern Territory had spent a season in the outer settlement of Ironvale, passing through on some errand she had never fully understood. He had been perhaps 18, lean and restless and kind in the offhand way of young men who don't yet know how to be deliberately kind. He had taught her to whistle. He had shared his bread with her on cold mornings. He had called her little son because of her hair. And she had followed him around for 3 months like a faithful hound, the way lonely children attached themselves to anyone who looked at them directly. When he left, he had taken the drawing with him. She remembered her mother pressing it into his hands at the gate. "So you remember her?" Ilara had said. "Come back someday." He never had. And now he was dead, and his brother was standing in a stone corridor in Ironvale Keep, holding the proof that Ronan Crest had carried her face with him for 16 years. "He kept it," she said. The words came out barely above a breath. "In his wallet, every day." Evander folded the paper again, the same careful hands. "I found it when I was going through his things. He had never told me about anyone in Ironvale. He had never told me about you." A pause, and then, with an honesty she had not expected from a man who seemed constructed entirely of reserve. "It took me 14 months to come here." June looked at him. The torchlight from the hall reached just far enough into the corridor to catch the angles of his face, and she thought she understood something then, that the stillness in him was not coldness, was not arrogance, but something else entirely. Grief, maybe. The particular stillness of someone who had been carrying a question for a long time and had only just found the door it belonged to. "He was kind to me," she said. "I was 7. He was the first person outside of my mother who looked at me like I was worth looking at." Something moved behind Evander's eyes. Not pity. She would have turned and walked away from pity. Something more complicated. Recognition, perhaps, of the specific weight of that kind of small, formative kindness, and what it meant that Ronan had never let go of it. Behind him, Soren and Davin had gone quiet in the way of men who understood that some moments required them to be furniture. "You were leaving," Evander said. "Yes." "Because of Ashford's son." It was not a question. She did not ask how he knew. She suspected that Soren, with those sharp eyes, had read the entire scene in the hall in under a minute. "It doesn't matter," she said. "It matters," he said, with a simplicity that made the words feel like a wall being built rather than a wound being opened. "Not I'm sorry. Just it matters. An acknowledgement, clean and solid." June looked at the corridor floor for one moment, then back up at him. "Why are you here tonight? The Crest territory hasn't sent a representative to an Ashford banquet in 30 years, he said. "I know." He looked at her steadily. "I came because the records your library sent to the Northern Archive 6 months ago included a cataloging note in the margin of a territorial map. The handwriting matched letters my brother kept." June went very still. She did remember those maps. She remembered the margins, the small notations she had added because the original cataloger had made errors in the boundary lines, and she had corrected them and initialed the corner in her usual small print. J. Just the letter. Just her. "You came because of a margin note," she said slowly. "I came," he said, "because my brother spent 16 years carrying a drawing of a child with the same handwriting as a woman who catalogs ancient territorial records in Ironvale, and I needed to understand why." He paused. "And because I needed to see whether she was real." The hall behind him swelled with music suddenly. The ceremony was beginning, the formal proceedings of the claiming banquet. Cole Ashford, somewhere in there, preparing to announce his intention to take Celeste Vorn as his mate before the assembled Alcatias. June stood in the corridor with the cold stone at her back, and the Alpha King of the Northern Territory looking at her as if she were the only thing in the building that required his full attention. She was, she realized, no longer thinking about leaving. The music from the hall rose and fell like a tide, and June remained in the corridor. She was not certain when the decision had been made. Perhaps it hadn't been a decision at all. Perhaps she had simply stopped moving toward the exit and that had been enough. Evander had not asked her to stay. He had not offered her anything that resembled persuasion. He had only looked at her with those pale eyes and spoken plainly. And there was something in that plainness that made her distrust leaving more than she distrusted staying. Davin had produced a small flask from somewhere inside his cloak and offered it to her with the cheerful pragmatism of a man who believed most situations were improved by warmth. She had accepted it. The wine was dark and heady, tasting of blackberries and something smoky, and it settled in her chest like a small fire. "The ceremony will go on for at least 2 hours," Soren said, leaning against the opposite wall with his arms crossed. "Ashford elders are thorough to the point of self-congratulation. We have time." "Time for what?" June asked. "For whatever this is," Davin said pleasantly, as if this were a perfectly self-evident category of event. She looked at Evander, who had settled himself against the wall beside the arch, not sitting, just resting his weight there with the ease of a man comfortable in his own body, and was watching her with that same unhurried attention. "Tell me about Ronan," she said. "Please." Something shifted in his expression at the name. Not pain exactly, but the shadow pain leaves behind when it has been present long enough to change the shape of things. He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that he was deciding not whether to speak, but how. "He was younger than me by 4 years, Evander said. He was restless in the way that some wolves are, always needing to move, to see the edges of things. When he was 18, I gave him leave to travel through the southern territories, because keeping him in the Crest Keep would have been like keeping a river inside a room." The faintest shift at the corner of his mouth. "He was gone for almost a year. When he came back, he was different, quieter. He never told me what he found. He found a lonely child who needed someone to share bread with," June said softly. "I think he found something he didn't know how to keep," Evander said. "Ronan was not good at staying. It was the one thing he could never teach himself." A pause. "He spent the next 16 years between the Crest territory and the eastern borders, always moving. He was a good fighter, a good scout. He was loyal. He stopped. He was the best of us, in some ways, the most genuinely kind." The corridor held the words for a moment. "How did he die?" June asked. "A border conflict with the Dravith pack. 14 months ago." His voice was even, but the evenness was the kind that was built rather than natural. "He died well. He died protecting 3 younger wolves who had no business being in that fight. That was entirely like him." June looked down at the flask in her hands. She thought of a boy of 18 sitting in tall grass, teaching a 7-year-old to whistle, sharing his bread without being asked, leaving after 3 months with a charcoal drawing pressed into his hands. She thought of that same boy becoming a man who moved through 16 years of borders and conflicts with a small piece of paper folded in his wallet, never explaining it to anyone. "So you remember her?" her mother had said. He had remembered. All that time he had remembered. "My mother died when I was 12, she said, not sure why she was saying it, except that it felt necessary, felt like the honest exchange this corridor required. She was the only person who ever made me feel like I came from something real. After she was gone, I was just the girl in the outer settlement. No pack name, no standing. Old Marta was kind, but she had her own grief. And the keep took me on as a library worker when I was 15 because I could read old scripts and no one else wanted the work." She turned the flask in her hands. "Cole Ashford noticed me 4 years ago. I thought it meant something. It meant he recognized value without understanding what to do with it," Soren said from across the corridor. There was no cruelty in it, just the clean assessment of a man who had spent years watching people miscalculate. "Soren," Davin said mildly. "She knows it's true," Soren replied. June almost smiled. He's not wrong. Evander had been watching her through all of this, and now he said, "Your mother." "Ilara." June looked up sharply. "You know her name?" Ronan kept letters. Not many. He was not a man for letters, but a few. Your mother wrote to him twice after he left Ironvale. He kept those as well. He reached into his armor again, and this time produced 2 small folded papers, more worn even than the drawing, the edges soft with age. I have not read them. I found them sealed and kept them that way. They were addressed to him. He held them out. June stared at them for a long moment before she crossed the corridor and took them from his hand. His fingers were warm. She noticed that, without meaning to, the brief transfer of heat as the papers passed between them. She unfolded the first letter carefully, conscious of how fragile the paper was, how the ink had faded to a soft brown at the edges. Her mother's handwriting was immediately recognizable, looping and careful, the hand of someone self-taught who had made beauty out of the effort. Dear Ronan, June asks about you still. She has learned to whistle properly now, and practices in the evenings until Marta tells her to stop. I want you to know that the time you spent here mattered more than I think you understood. She had no one to show her that the world could be generous. You showed her that. I hope the North is treating you well. The second letter was shorter, dated 2 years later. Ronan, I am not well. I don't say this to burden you, but because I want someone to know who knew her before. June is strong in the way that quiet children become strong when no one is looking. She will be fine. I believe that. But she does not know yet what she carries. Her father's line is older than either of us understood. I found the records last winter, deep in the Ironvale archive. She is descended from the Vale bloodline. I don't know what that means for her future. I only know she deserves to understand it someday. Keep the drawing safe. Ilara. June read the second letter twice. Then she stood very still in the cold corridor with the paper in her hands, and the name her mother had written ringing in her head like a struck bell. The Vale bloodline. She was not ignorant of pack history. She had spent 8 years in the Ironvale library cataloging lineage records and territorial maps, and she knew the name Vielle the way she knew the names of ancient mountain ranges, distant, enormous, and believed to be long gone. The Vielle were the oldest recorded wolf bloodline in the known territories, a line of wolves whose scent was said to carry a frequency that other wolves felt as authority, as pull, as something older than hierarchy. They had been thought extinct for 200 years. Her mother had found the records. Her mother had known, and had written it in a letter to a traveling boy, and had died before she could tell her daughter, and the letter had sat in a dead man's keeping for 16 years. June lowered the paper slowly. She became aware, in the silence that followed, that Evander was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him yet. Something attentive and very careful. The look of a man who has been waiting for someone to reach the edge of a truth he already stood on the other side of. You knew, she said. I suspected, he said. When I read your mother's name in Ronan's things, I recognized the Vale connection from old Crest records. My family's archive is extensive and very old. A pause. I did not know it was you until I saw you tonight. You said you needed to see if I was real. Yes, but you already knew something before you came. I knew there was a woman in Ironvale with Vale blood and Ronan's loyalty, and that she had been left alone for 23 years with no one to tell her what she was. Something moved behind his eyes, controlled, but not cold. That seemed like a thing that needed correcting. From inside the hall, a voice rose above the music. Elder Rowan Ashford, beginning the formal proceedings of the ceremony. June heard Cole's name spoken aloud, and then Celeste Vorn's, and the assembled Alcatayas murmured their acknowledgement. She did not look toward the hall. She looked at Evander Crest, king of the Northern Territory, who had traveled south with a charcoal drawing and 2 old letters, and the particular stillness of a man who had decided something important, and was waiting with genuine patience to see what she would decide in return. The Vile bloodline, she said quietly. What does that mean? For me, practically. It means, he said, that the reason every alpha in that hall noticed you tonight was not coincidence. June thought of Cole's expression when she had turned away from him. the flash of something he couldn't name, the sudden uncertainty. She thought of the way the hall had watched her cross toward the corridor, the glances she had taken for pity or curiosity. "They felt it," she said. "They felt it," he confirmed. "Most of them won't know what it was, but I do." The music swelled again from the hall, and somewhere in its warmth, Cole Ashford was announcing his future. And June stood in a cold corridor, holding her dead mother's letters and understanding, for the first time in her life, that she had never been invisible. She had only been standing in the wrong light. The ceremony ended sometime past midnight. June knew this because the music stopped, and the hall beyond the corridor filled with the looser noise of celebration, wine being poured freely, voices climbing over each other, the particular relief of formal proceedings giving way to ordinary human warmth. She had remained in the corridor through all of it, and at some point Davin had disappeared and returned with a plate of food from the banquet table, presenting it with the gravity of a man performing an important service. She had eaten. She had not realized how hungry she was until the first bite. Evander had remained where he was, against the wall beside the arch, and they had talked. Not continuously. There were stretches of silence between them that felt easy rather than empty, the kind of silence that happened between people who had no need to fill space to prove their comfort in it. But they had talked, and June had learned that Ronan had been afraid of heights, which seemed improbable for a wolf, and that the Crest Keep had a library that made the Ironvale archive look like a single shelf, and that Evander had not attended a formal banquet of any kind in 6 years, because he found them, in his exact words, exhausting in a way that battle never was. She had laughed at that. A real laugh, the kind she hadn't expected to produce tonight. He had watched her laugh with an expression she was beginning to recognize. Not quite a smile, but something that lived in the same region of the face, a particular quality of attention that meant he was storing the moment somewhere. It was Soren who finally said, around the time the corridor had grown cold enough that June's breath was faintly visible, that they needed to consider the practical situation. "You can't go back to a room above the library," he said to June, with the directness she had come to understand was simply how he communicated, rather than rudeness. "Not tonight. The banquet guests will be in the halls until dawn, and half of them felt your scent earlier without knowing what it was. By morning, Sorenvorn's people will have talked, and Elder Ashford will have talked, and someone will start asking questions about who you are, and where you sleep." "I've slept there for 8 years, June said. "You've slept there as a woman no one looked at twice," Soren replied. "That changed approximately 3 hours ago." She knew he was right. She had understood it, somewhere in the back of her mind. From the moment Evander had said vile bloodline, in a voice that treated it as fact rather than legend. The world she had moved through quietly for 8 years, invisible, unremarkable, the library girl, had shifted on its axis tonight, and the room above the archive was part of that old world. She looked at Evander. "I won't ask you to trust me because I am a king," he said, as if he had anticipated the nature of her silence. "I'll ask you because Ronan trusted you enough to carry your face for 16 years, and in my experience, his judgment about people was the most reliable thing about him." June was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are you proposing?" "Guest quarters in the East Wing tonight. Tomorrow we talk. About the vile records. About what your mother found. About what happens next. Nothing is decided tonight except that you are safe." A pause. "You can leave in the morning if you choose. I will not prevent it. But I would like you to stay long enough to hear what I know." There was nothing in his face that resembled manipulation. There was only the same straightforward attention he had given everything since he walked into the corridor. Direct, patient, asking without demanding. She thought of her mother's letter. She does not know yet what she carries. "All right," she said. The East Wing of Ironvale Keep had been given over to the Crest delegation for the duration of their stay, which June gathered had surprised Elder Ashford considerably, given that the Crest territory had not accepted Ashford hospitality in 3 decades. The guest quarters were large and cold in the way of old stone rooms, but someone had built a fire in the hearth, and the bed had clean linens, and after the corridor it felt generous. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay with her mother's letters on the blanket beside her and read them again in the firelight, the words she had already memorized settling into new shapes now that she had context for them. She does not know yet what she carries. Her mother had known. Her mother had found the records in the archive where June herself had worked for 8 years, and June had never looked in the right place, had never known to look. She thought about whether she was angry at that, and decided she wasn't. Her mother had been dying, and had done the best she could, and had written the truth to the only person she knew who might someday find her daughter and tell her. It had taken 16 years and a dead man's wallet, but the letter had arrived. In the morning, she found Evander in the small study adjacent to the guest wing, standing over a table spread with documents, old ones she could see from the doorway, the kind of aged parchment the Ironvale archive used for records older than 2 centuries. He had clearly been there for some time. His fur mantle was draped over the chair behind him, and he had rolled the sleeves of his linen undershirt to the elbows in the way of someone who had settled in for careful work. He looked up when she entered, and she had the distinct impression that he had heard her coming long before she appeared in the doorway. "You slept," he said. "Eventually." She crossed to the table and looked at the documents. Her librarian's eye caught the script immediately. Old Pack notation, the territorial dialect used in records predating the current Alcatea system. "Are these from the Crest archive?" "Copies I made before we traveled." He moved one sheet toward her. "This is the Vile lineage record. The original is in the Crest library. It was part of a collection my grandfather acquired from a dissolved pack 2 generations ago. He didn't know what he had." June looked at the document. The lineage was mapped in the branching style of old pack records, names connected by lines that indicated mating bonds and bloodlines, the script so small in places she had to lean close. She traced the branches with her eye, following them forward through generations, and then she found it. A branch that diverged from the main line perhaps 150 years back, moving south, the names becoming less legible as the line thinned toward the present. At the end of the branch, in handwriting, she recognized as newer than the rest, someone had added it later, carefully, in ink that hadn't aged the same way, were 2 names. Ilara, June. Her own name in a document 2 centuries old, added by a hand she didn't know. "Who wrote this?" she asked. "Ronan," Evander said quietly. "After he came back from Ironvale. He found the record in the archive and added the names himself. He never told me. I found it when I was going through the collection after his death." June stared at her own name on the ancient parchment. Ronan at 18, spending a season in the outer settlement, teaching a 7-year-old to whistle. Ronan finding the connection in the Crest archive afterward, and writing her name into the record. Carrying the drawing. Never coming back, but never letting go. "He was going to tell me," she said. It wasn't a question. "I believe so. I think he was waiting until he understood what it meant." Ronan was cautious with important things. He wanted to be certain before he spoke. Evander paused. He ran out of time. The fire in the study hearth had burned down to steady coals, and the morning light came through the narrow window in flat gray sheets. Somewhere in the rest of the keep, the banquet guests were beginning their slow departures, and the world outside this room was resuming its ordinary motion. June straightened from the document. "The Vielle bloodline," she said. "What does it actually mean for my life going forward? Not the history, the practical reality." Evander looked at her with something that might have been respect for the directness of the question. "It means you have a legitimate claim to standing in any pack in the known territories. The Vale line predates the current Alcatea hierarchy. Its recognition overrides pack politics. No elder can dismiss you as having no name." He paused. "It also means that the pull other wolves felt from you last night will not diminish. You cannot go back to being invisible, even if you wish to." "And the Crest territory?" she asked. "Why does this concern you personally?" He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment, she saw something move behind his careful expression. Not evasion, but the particular honesty of someone choosing how much truth to offer at once. Because Ronan loved you, he said finally. Not the way a man loves a woman. You were 7 years old and he was 18, and he was not that kind of man in any case. But he loved you the way some people love the first thing that showed them the world could be worth staying in. He never forgot you. He spent 16 years in motion, because he could never quite find what he'd left behind in that settlement. A pause, and something quieter. I spent 14 months being angry at him for dying, before he finished what he started. Coming here was the only way I could think of to finish it for him. June looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, in the courtyard below, she could hear the Ashford stable hands beginning their morning work, the sound of horses and cold air, and the ordinary industry of a keep waking up. And somewhere in that same building, Cole Ashford was waking beside the future he had chosen, the future that had required him to look at June and calculate that she was not worth the cost. She thought about that without bitterness. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that the bitterness had largely dissolved overnight, replaced by something cleaner. Not forgiveness exactly, but the particular clarity that came from understanding that what she had lost was never truly hers to begin with. What was hers was here on this table. Her mother's handwriting, her own name in old ink, a dead young man's careful act of recording her into history before anyone else thought to. And across the table, a king who had traveled south with a drawing and 2 letters, and the patience to wait for her to catch up to what he already knew. "I'd like to see the Crest Library," she said. Something shifted in Evander's expression. Subtle, but real. "I was hoping you would say that." From somewhere down the corridor, Davin's voice rose cheerfully above the morning quiet, apparently already in negotiation with someone about breakfast, and Soren's dry response followed a moment later, and the study held its warmth, and June stood beside an ancient document with her own name in it, and understood that the life she had been building quietly in the wrong place was finally, carefully, beginning to point in the right direction. They left Ironvale 3 days later. June had not planned to stay even one additional day beyond that first morning, but there had been the documents to review, and then Soren had located 3 more records in the Ironvale archive itself, buried in a section she had catalogued 2 years ago without recognizing their significance. And then Davin had somehow befriended every stable hand and kitchen worker in the keep, and gathered information about the outer settlement that June hadn't known herself, small histories of families who had known her mother, people who remembered Alara with the quiet warmth reserved for those taken too soon. She had spent one afternoon in the outer settlement with old Marta, sitting in the small kitchen that smelled of dried lavender and wood smoke, and told her everything. Marta had listened with her hands folded on the table, and her eyes very bright. And when June finished, she had said, in the matter-of-fact tone she applied to most things, "Your mother always said you came from something old. I never knew what she meant. Now I do." June had held Marta's hands for a long time before she left. On the morning of departure, Elder Rowan Ashford appeared in the courtyard as the Crest horses were being readied. He was a tall man gone gray at the temples, with the careful dignity of someone who had spent decades managing the politics of a significant pack. And he looked at June with an expression she recognized as recalibration, the specific look of a man updating his understanding of a situation he believed he had already correctly assessed. Cole was beside him. June saw Cole see her, and watched him understand in a single glance that she was leaving with the Crest delegation. That Evander stood at her left shoulder with the natural ease of someone who had decided where he stood. That Soren and Davin flanked them with the calm readiness of men who belonged to a world Cole Ashford would never quite inhabit. Cole's face went through several things quickly. She watched them pass. The surprise, the recalculation, and then, arriving last and too late, the recognition of what he had dismissed. He said her name. Just that. June. She looked at him with the full and honest attention that she had never quite been able to deny him before, and found that it cost her nothing now. Not anger, not grief, not the complicated pull of 4 years of slow-built hope. "I hope you're happy, Cole," she said. And she meant it plainly without sharpness, because she did hope it. She simply no longer needed it to have anything to do with her. She turned and walked to where the horses waited. The road north was long and beautiful in the way of late autumn. The trees stripped to their architecture, the sky a cold, clean gray, the ground hard with the first frost that had come overnight. June rode between Evander and Davin, and Soren rode ahead, reading documents he had somehow kept dry through the river crossing, and continued to read with the single-minded focus of a man who considered travel a productive opportunity. On the second day, when they camped in the shelter of an old stone way station half covered in ivy, Evander sat beside her at the fire and told her more about the Crest territory, the geography of it, the 3 branch packs that owed the main keep their allegiance, the library that occupied the entire north wing of the keep and contained records going back 4 centuries. He told her about the pack's current structure and the alliances they maintained with 2 eastern territories and 1 northern clan that communicated almost entirely through written treaty. He spoke about these things with the quiet thoroughness of someone sharing what was real and important about themselves, not performing, not impressing, simply opening a door and showing what was behind it. She told him about the maps she had catalogued over 8 years, the errors she had found in lineage records that no one else had noticed, the particular pleasure of old scripts that most wolves considered too archaic to bother learning. She told him about the afternoon her mother had taught her to read, using a water-stained book of territorial histories, because it was the only book they owned, and how she had read it so many times she had memorized it, and how that memorized book had become the foundation of every skill that had eventually made her useful to the Ironvale library. Evander listened to all of it, with the full attention she was learning was simply how he was. Not performing interest, not waiting for his turn to speak, but genuinely present with whatever she gave him. On the 3rd evening, with the Crest Keep visible in the distance, its stone towers rising from the tree line against a sky going amber at the edges, he said, "There is something I haven't told you." She looked at him. "The vile lineage record," he said. "The section that documents the bloodline's significance. There is a passage I didn't show you in Ironvale because I thought you had enough to carry in one morning." He paused. The Vale line was historically bonded to the Crest line, not politically, by nature. The old records call it a resonance, 2 bloodlines that recognized each other. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "I felt it when I saw you across the hall in Ironvale, before I knew who you were, before I had decided to approach you." June was quiet, absorbing this. "And now?" she asked. "Now I know who you are," he said, "which means the decision is real rather than instinct. That matters to me." He glanced at her then, and his pale eyes were direct and honest. "I am not asking you for anything tonight. I am telling you what I know, so that you have the full truth to make your own choices from. That's all." She thought about what it meant to be given truth as a foundation, rather than as a persuasion tool. She thought about how different it felt from 4 years of half-spoken intentions and postponed promises. "All right," she said. "Thank you for telling me." He nodded, and they rode the last stretch to the keep in the easy silence that had become, over 3 days of road and firelight, entirely natural between them. The Crest Keep was everything he had described and more. The library alone made her stand in the doorway for a full minute before she could move, taking in the shelves that rose to the vaulted ceiling, the rolling ladders on iron tracks, the reading tables with their brass lamp fixtures, the smell of old parchment and leather binding and beeswax that was the finest smell she had ever encountered in a room. Evander watched her from behind with the expression she had come to think of as his particular version of satisfaction. Contained, quiet, but entirely genuine. "This is yours to work in," he said simply, "for as long as you choose to stay." She chose to stay. The months that followed were not without difficulty. There were pack elders who questioned the sudden presence of an unknown woman in the Crest Keep, and Soren handled them with a precision that June came to deeply respect, presenting the vile documentation with the calm authority of someone who had prepared for every objection and found each one manageable. There were 2 formal challenges from allied pack leaders who felt the vile recognition upset existing hierarchies, and Evander addressed these in the great hall of the keep with a brevity and finality that closed both matters in under an hour. There was an afternoon when June sat alone in the library and felt the full weight of everything that had changed, and cried in the specific, exhausted way of someone who had been strong for a very long time. And then Davin knocked on the door with tea and a plate of honey cakes, and sat across the table from her saying nothing useful and everything necessary. And through all of it, Evander was present in the way she had come to understand was his nature. Not hovering, not managing, but simply there, steady and real, giving her space when she needed it and attention when she sought it, never pretending things were easier than they were, and never making them heavier than they had to be. The bond between them grew the way important things grew, not in a single moment, but through accumulation. Through mornings in the library when he brought her records she hadn't known to ask for. Through evenings at the fire when the conversation moved between practical and personal without friction. Through one particular night when a winter storm closed the keep entirely, and they sat on opposite sides of his study reading different documents, and the silence was so complete and so comfortable that it felt like a kind of declaration. She told him that night that she loved him. She said it the same way she had learned to say most true things, directly without ceremony, as a fact she was offering him rather than a performance she was giving. He looked up from his document, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Not surprised exactly, but something softer than surprise. Something that looked like arrival. "I know," he said. "I've been carrying that same thing since Ironvale, and waiting to be certain it was mine to say." He said it then. And it was. They bonded in the spring, in a private ceremony in the keep's inner courtyard with Soren and Davin as witnesses, and old Marta, who had traveled north for the occasion, sitting in the best chair anyone could find, and watching with the expression of someone who had always known things would eventually arrive at their correct destination. June wore silver, her own design, sewn with her own hands, because some things were worth continuing. The Crest Pack accepted her with the particular respect given to things that have been correctly understood, not easily, but fully, in the way that matters. The elders who had questioned her presence came to understand, over time, that what the keep had gained was not a political arrangement, but something rarer. A woman who knew the true history of every bloodline in the archive and treated that knowledge as a living thing worth protecting. She wrote to the Ironvale Library and arranged for copies of their oldest records to be sent north, and spent 3 years building a cross-referenced catalog that connected the Crest Archive with 6 other regional collections. Soren called it the most significant organizational achievement in 4 centuries of pack record keeping. He said this in the tone he used for all compliments, as if he were simply reporting a fact, which made it, she had come to understand, entirely sincere. Davin told everyone. Cole Ashford married Celeste Vaughan that same spring, and June heard of it from Marta's letter, with the same uncomplicated goodwill she had offered him in the courtyard. They built their life, and she built hers, and the distance between those two facts was the most comfortable distance she had ever known. Ronan's drawing, the charcoal sketch of a 7-year-old in tall grass, worn soft with 16 years of careful keeping. She had framed and hung in the library, in the corner where the morning light fell best. She looked at it sometimes when the work was going well, and the keep was quiet, and thought about a young man who had written her name into a document because he believed she deserved to exist in history and had carried her face because some things were worth carrying, and had died before he could finish what he started. She thought he would have liked how it ended. She thought, looking around the library that smelled of old parchment and beeswax, listening to the sounds of the keep going about its life beyond the door, feeling the quiet and certain weight of everything that had finally arrived at its right place. She thought her mother would have liked it too. Outside the library window, the Crest territory stretched north under a wide spring sky, and somewhere in the keep, Evander was reading documents with his sleeves rolled up, and Marta was arguing pleasantly with the kitchen staff about the correct way to make tea, and Soren was annotating something with his characteristic precision, and Davin was making friends with everyone within a reasonable radius, as was his nature and his gift. And June sat in the library with her mother's letters in the drawer beside her, her own name written in old ink on ancient parchment, in a document 2 centuries older than anyone who had ever dismissed her, and understood, completely and finally, that she had never been invisible. She had only been waiting for the right story to begin.